Now my pleasure to bring to you Ms. Rosemary Hobson and her paper, Machiavelli's Ideals to Stay in Power.
Multiple authors have spoken on the characteristics of rulers and have painted the components and facets of military and political leadership in hundreds of different lights. However, military leadership and political leadership are in completely different categories. In military leadership, hundreds if not thousands of lives are on the line, and often the responsibility is placed mainly on the shoulders of one man, with decisions made in real time. Throughout the course of history, the definition of a responsible and effective leader has changed from time to time, but the skeleton of leadership has stayed the same. Machiavelli writes on the requirements for an efficient and successful military leader who is to remain in power. His 5 qualities of leadership are detailed in the prince as follows. Must use his own arms, must be well-read, must not be generous, must be feared rather than hated, and finally must learn to be cunning as the fox and forceful as the lion. Rulers throughout history have displayed some of these principles. Tiberius of Rome, Darius of Persia, and Croesus of Lydia all displayed different lives lived and battles won through these principles or lack thereof. The stories of these men and their personal and career accomplishments show the different experiences and leadership styles in commanding both their armies and their countries throughout ancient history. These narratives of the struggle to stay in power also demonstrate the utility of Machiavelli's principles and the part they play in efficient leadership that benefits the general, the soldiers who fight, and the country he leads. The first important principle put forward for military leadership is the use of the leader's own arms and military power to stay in power rather than mercenary or the auxiliary arms of another country's military. Machiavelli argues that the arms of others either fall off your back or weigh you down or hold you tight. He further elaborates on this directive, claiming that using the arms of others takes away any victory and causes the leader to fall into one of 2 traps. In mercenary arms, laziness is more dangerous. In auxiliary arms, virtue is. A wise prince, therefore, has always avoided these arms and turned to his own. In this way, the leader manages to keep the interests of his own country safe and does not overreach for greater territory and power than he can effectively govern. The reliance of oneself on the arms of his own country serves as an example of leadership in other aspects of government, such as law enforcement, public relations, and the personal matters of the ruler as well. Reliance on the help of other countries, both in peace and in war, is seen as suicide in Machiavelli's mind and can only end one way, with the country dying either by debt to the mercenary or by surrender due to the lack of commitment by the auxiliary soldiers. Machiavelli then addresses a totally different issue, and his second principle entails the need for a good leader to be well-read and specifically to study at great length military history and the history of the rise and fall of the country. But as to the exercise of the mind,
Rosemary, we're going to have to take a pause here. Everybody down there, if you guys could all stand up, and we're going to try to shut those doors. So, got a little bit of tree trimming going on out there, which means you got to be flexible. So, yeah. Without the chainsaws in the background, hopefully.
Alright.
Oh, can somebody close that window back over there? Yep. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, Patrick, can you close the door? Thank you. Okay, so continuing on without the lumberjack effect.
Alright. But as to the exercise of the mind, a prince should read histories and consider in them the actions of excellent men, should see how they conduct themselves in wars, should examine the causes of their victories and losses, so as to be able to avoid the latter and imitate the former. He argues that even in times of peace, a good leader should be simultaneously focused on the growth and training of the military and exercise of the mind through study and reading. The studying of tactics and strategy for the leader comes in two forms. The mental exercise consists of studying the actions of past leaders and thinking of future conflicts and defenses of the country, whereas the physical exercise is comprised of drilling soldiers, hunting, staying physically alert and able, and finally keeping the country strong and defendable. Thus, a prince should have no other object but the art of war and its orders and discipline, for that is the only art which is of concern to one who commands. The greatest concern of a leader should be his military power and the prowess of his armed lance. In peacetime, it is most important as well as hardest to maintain the country. A wise prince should observe such modes and never remain idle in peacetime, but with his industry make capital of them in order to be able to profit from them in adversities, so that when fortune changes, it will find him ready to resist them. Machiavelli explains the need of education in the life of a leader for the good of both the country in peacetime and for preparation to engage in future warfare and maintain the rule of the people. The third principle that Machiavelli presents is that the leader must not be liberal or generous, for when one falls into that trap, he loses the respect of the people he rules over and can easily be removed from office. Though at first glance this seems odd, according to Machiavelli, liberality is rarely beneficial for either the leader or for the people who are on the receiving end of this action. It would be good to be held liberal. Nonetheless, liberality, when used so that you may be held liberal, harms you. Leaders often use liberality to gain popularity in the general population by giving promises that cannot be kept or gifts at the expense of the very people the leader is supposedly helping. The result of this is that it will be necessary, if he wants to maintain a name for liberality, to burden the people extraordinarily, to be rigorous with taxes, and to do all those things that can be done to get money. This will inevitably result in the people hating the ruler and cause more harm than resisting the temptation to modify the status quo and not putting on a cloak of liberality. However, Machiavelli does note that if it is done in the shadows and not for show, liberality can be a good trait, or at least not a harmful one at first. For if it is used virtuously and as it should be used, it may not be recognized, and you will not escape the infamy of its contrary. He goes on to state that, as with any liberality, that a prince who has done this will always consume all his resources in such deeds. Furthermore, any liberality, even if done in secret, will lead to increased taxation of the people, increased resentment and anger of the people turning on the leader, and thus causing a loss of stability, respect of his people, and decrease the level of mercy towards his subject. This fourth principle, Machiavelli makes it crystal clear that it is not necessary or even advisable for leaders to be loved by his subjects. Extreme emotional responses of any kind are not healthy or preferred, as the subjects of the leader will react most violently to these extremes. Each prince should desire to be held merciful and not cruel. Nonetheless, he should take care not to use this mercy badly. The leader must maintain his authority by being strict with almost all cases, but taking care to show mercy to his subjects on occasion to keep respect of the people. The balance is difficult to continue consistently, and to be feared and loved often is not a feasible state of being. But the answer is that one would want to be both the one and the other, but because it is difficult to put them together, it is much safer to be feared than loved if one has to lack one of the two. The leader is feared but not loved. He is still respected by the people, but the inverse of this removes any respect that his subjects have for him. As, if they love the leader, they are more likely to see him as one of them. Whereas if they fear him, they see him as above them and as having great power, influence, and authority. However, in the acquisition of the fear of the people, it is easy, if not expected, for a leader to receive the hatred of the people, which must be avoided by the leader to maintain the respect of the people. The prince should nonetheless make himself feared in such a mode that if he does not acquire love, he escapes hatred, because being feared and not being hated can go together very well. This balancing act can be accomplished by not treating the people with disdain, not taking their women, and absolutely not taking the belongings of his subjects. I conclude then, returning to being feared and loved, that since men have at their convenience and fear, at the convenience of the prince, a wise prince should only contrive to avoid hatred. Therefore, a leader should strive primarily to not be hated, and secondarily to be feared and respected by his people, but not to be loved by the people. Machiavelli's final principle for an effective leader is that he be as a fox to recognize the snares of his opponents, and as a lion to scare away the wolves who attempt to overthrow him. The leader must know how to be a beast and a man. He must be able to use laws and force to express his ideas and enforce his emotions, his decisions. As the princes who have done great things are those who have taken little count of faith and have known how to get around man's brains with their astuteness. In the end, they have overcome those who have founded themselves on loyalty. The leader must learn to act in a way that appears to be virtuous and fearful, and must be able to recognize the need to act flexible in the face of changing circumstances. A prudent lord, therefore, cannot observe faith, nor should he, when such observances turn against him, and the causes that made him promise have been eliminated. One could give infinite modern examples of this, and show how many peace treaties and promises have been rendered invalid and vain through the infidelity of princes. And the one who has known best how to use the fox has come out best. Examples of the necessity for the fox's cunning are shown throughout the history of the world and have been necessary to succeed in this fallen world, such as in the Trojan War with the use of the wooden horse to infiltrate the city after traditional warfare had failed. Both in modern history in rising politically and militarily, and in ancient history in mythology and historical accounts. All five of these principles are displayed in different ways in the lives of the three men highlighted in the following paragraphs. The king of Lydia, Croesus, is an example of an effective military and political leader who stayed in power successfully. Reigning as the king for 14 years, Croesus kept Lydia out of the war with the surrounding countries for many years, and knew when it was necessary to join the fray for the maximum benefit of his country. In keeping with Machiavelli's second principle, once he had been told by his allies to try and challenge Persia, he carefully consulted with the oracle at Delphi and took the time to prepare for the war by building his army and expanding his allies. He tests the oracle before believing it and follows the advice of the oracle by making an alliance with the Hellenic nations. The expedition begins with taking Cappadocia, which is halted by an eclipse, and continues with indecisive battles and some smatterings of victory. However, he subsequently retreats and asks his allies to join the Lydians in fighting Cyrus's army. His request comes too late, and the army of Cyrus falls to the Persians. Croesus falls to the Persians. But he is saved by Cyrus and put in as an advisor. This demonstrates the importance of a country using its own troops to attack and not making unnecessary allegiance. Croesus had an unconventional career as leader, but he led his men with all the wisdom he could muster and continued to function as he thought was best for his army. He was wise and understood the importance of the relationship between war and keeping in power. King Croesus embodied some but not all of Machiavelli's leadership principles. He led his country with wisdom but did not have a perfect military strategy, and occasionally was too confident in his alliances. In the surrender of his army, Croesus did not keep with Machiavelli's first principle of not using any mercenary or auxiliary arms to defend or conquer in warfare, which was his eventual failure. Darius, king of Persia, is a man who created the monarchy in the ancient Persian Empire and started the Great Persian War. His scheming to win the election of the king at the beginning of his reign demonstrates Machiavelli's fifth principle of cunning. This fox-like cunning continues with dividing Persia into provinces that live under him and pay him tribute. He assigned to each nation the tribute it would pay to him, organizing nations together with the peoples on their borders and combining more distant peoples into various single satrapies with one another. Without mercy, Darius quenches any signs of rebellion by not only those close to him, but also by the common people, by controlling water levels and by executing the leaders of rebellion. However, despite his ruthfulness, he still managed to show mercy to those whom he thought deserving on occasion, to ensure that he is not hated by the people and that he is able to retain the throne. Darius is careful in his military engagements and sends spies before attacking Greece to be sure of his steps and to collect intelligence for his army and the Persian Empire. He is aware of the plot of Demosthenes to escape and keeps the army aware while not letting himself become manipulated. As instructed, as soon as the day dawned, he summoned 15 eminent Persians, and he instructed them specifically to make sure, by all means, that Demosthenes did not escape and to bring him back. Darius continues to capture his first city, Samos, and begins his campaign of war against the Grecian city-states. He is a fair man and returns the country of Samos to the leader Seleucid, to whom he is partially in debt. When a revolt rises against him in Babylon, Darius besieges the city and trusts his right-hand man, Zopyrus, to lead and infiltrate the city. He thus regains control of the wall, and Babylon was successfully captured by the Persians at a low material and manpower cost, and more importantly, with the city still intact rather than destroyed by a violent invasion. Finally, as they had arranged, Darius made his attack around the wall, and it was then that the deceit of Zopyrus was fully revealed. Thus, Babylon was taken a second time. Darius avenged his country and defeated the Scythians who had attacked Persia in Asia Minor. He used his own troops to defeat the rebels in Babylon and did not hire any mercenaries following the instructions of Machiavelli. He built a bridge to easily take his army across the Bosphorus Strait in the Black Sea to attack and leave the bridge guarded by borrowed soldiers from Ionia. This stratagem succeeds in allowing the army to retreat in an orderly fashion, but fails to conquer the land he is trying to gain. Darius continues to lead his army to many victories in Babylon against the Thracians and the Scythians, and keeps the Persian Empire at war constantly for years at a time with extraordinarily little peace in his reign. Despite these successes, Darius was gullible and used by both Demosthenes when he is guiding the Persians through Hellas, and by the Scythians when the Persians are trying to take the country, to the detriment of both him and his empire. In many cases, his constant desire for revenge led to avoidable failures that resulted in loss of men and resources. However, despite these failures, overall, he embodied many of Machiavelli's leadership principles. He used the arms of Persia rather than mercenary or auxiliary troops. He kept the army in a good training, even during peace times. He maintained a status among the people and was neither loved nor hated. Finally, he was able to prevent revolt and was cunning in the commandeering of his army. Tiberius Gracchus was the tribune of Rome and led by intimidating throughout the course of his reign. He was elected by the people of Rome, though many believe that his mother greatly influenced his election. Demonstrating both the cunning of the fox and the appearance of the lion, he responded to these accusations in a wise and concise fashion. Tiberius, maintaining an honorable and just cause, and possessed of eloquence sufficient to have made a less credible action appear plausible. He began his reign by eliminating his enemies, and ended it by having eliminated too many of his allies. He was not liberal or generous overall, but on occasion he showed mercy to select subjects, as in the example of the Hortensius family losing their wealth. He would, if the Senate approved, bestow 200,000 sesterces on each of Hortensius's male children. There were grateful acknowledgments. He used these incidents of kindness to temporarily stop the hatred of the people and tried to stay in their favor in keeping with Machiavelli's third principle. Tiberius stayed in war only when it benefited Rome and was necessary by legions, or needed to quell revolts and rebellions in the Roman Empire. He took advantage of circumstances such as a great earthquake to remove from the Senate those with whom he disagreed or who lacked the resources to support his endeavors. In the same year, 12 famous cities in the province of Asia were overwhelmed by an earthquake. He removed from the Senate, or allowed to resign, persons whose means had vanished through extravagance or misbehavior. He was a leader who preferred peace over endless war and was willing to negotiate to save lives and resources. Tiberius was happier to have secured peace by prudent negotiations than if he had fought a victorious war. He used these tactics in multiple different situations with various levels of success, while also maintaining a semblance of peace in the homeland. While keeping the country out of war, he maintained a strong military presence and was prepared mentally to fight. Tiberius went into office with an intact government, ruled to a certain extent by the people of Rome, but he destroyed any semblance of democracy that Rome held. Tiberius is almost an exemplary Machiavellian leader, as he demonstrates all 5 of the principles put forth. He was a wise military leader in many ways and stayed in power for over 20 years. He was not seen as overly generous and yet still continued to command respect from the people. He was not loved by the people due to his unpleasant, slightly tyrannical policies, but he still avoided the hatred of the general populace. Finally, he reached the throne and the level of power he attained through his cunning and maintained it through the nobility that he put on as a persona once in office. All 3 of these men had different manners by which they displayed Machiavelli's leadership requirements to stay in power. Darius of Persia, Croesus of Lydia, and Tiberius of Rome came from distinct cultures, countries, and levels of capability. Each man ruled by various means and methods to lead their people. Machiavelli's 5 principles of leadership are displayed in Croesus, Tiberius, and Darius, and fulfilled in different ways and to a different extent by each one of them. The first principle given is the importance of not using mercenary or auxiliary arms to defend or make conquest for the ruler. The second is to maintain expertise on both tactical warfare, training of troops for fighting, especially during peace times. The third is not to be seen as overly generous or liberal to the people of the country. The fourth is contradictory, but in actuality works well in tandem, as the ruler must solely not be hated or loved, but only slightly feared. Finally, to sum all the principles up, the ruler must be cunning like a fox and noble as a lion. All these Machiavellian principles give a standard to hold the following 3 leaders to in character. Though each of these leaders portrayed various parts of the principles, overall the leadership principles Machiavelli puts forward are displayed throughout history as highlighted in the lives of these 3 men. These principles, though not constituting a moral or just leader, are shown to be productive in the quest of leaders who stay in power for extended periods of time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hobson. I do try to do my best at engaging with papers and try to make a successful schedule. However, I realize that your paper, being very detailed in historical detail, was really not the right paper to put Saturday morning. And so I am having a little trouble keeping all these details straight. So being that you're chipper and awake and have this material down, I would like you you took up Tiberius and you said he demonstrates all 5 of the principles. Could you just kind of go back a little bit, slow it down for us? And how does Tiberius himself exhibit successfully attaining all 5 of these Machiavellian principles?
Okay, so the first principle is not using mercenary or auxiliary arms. He doesn't ever really use those, and he's very careful to keep his country in check. The second one is to study the tactics and keep informed on military developments, and he is able to do that successfully. In fact, so successfully that he's able to negotiate peace with different countries and quell the revolts in his empire. The third principle is that he is not liberal or generous overall, but he is able to show mercy on occasion, as in the case of the Hortensius family. And then the fourth principle is, I think I mixed up the order a little bit, is that he was not hated, but he was feared, and he was respected because of his power and the way he had maintained and developed a persona of sorts. The fifth is that he was cunning, as a fox, but still was able to put on a persona of a lion and try to appear as noble and strong, which he did successfully. Even though he wasn't a noble person, he was able to put on that ideal and try to portray it to a certain extent.
Okay, thank you very much. A number of the characteristics that you put forward do seem to require a certain amount of balancing. It doesn't seem to be a sort of just a distinct trait that one can follow in a sort of exclusive fashion, but there's kind of an eye on both of these that need to be gone. Liberality seems to be a difficult one, as it appears one needs to be generous but not too generous. Can you say more about just how that is supposed to be, where that balance is to be found?
Yes. So Machiavelli talks about this, and he believes, and I think that the balance is found in not being overly liberal or generous to the people as a whole, but when necessary, having the capability to show mercy, as in the case of Tiberius with that family. And then I believe there might be an example with Darius. I don't know if I have that one down. But even though they were not merciful leaders, they were able to kind of use those instances to their advantage, and take those times to kind of demonstrate, oh, look, like that's kind of part of the putting on of the noble characteristics of the lion to a certain extent. But I think overall, liberality or generosity is not encouraged because of the cost it has to the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the fact that Machiavelli talks about if you're really being too generous and giving out too many things to the people, you have to start raising taxes, and that's it. That is a problem for any ruler. In the Republic, Plato lambasts Pericles for doing so much stuff for the people, building docks, an extra temple. They think he criticizes Pericles and says he's just kind of, indulging the people in so many things is bad for their character. And but isn't it it seems like it's the responsibility of a ruler to be kind of working for the benefit of the community, which means there seems to be things that have to be done, buying soldiers good equipment, making sure that there are docks and, the elements for commerce and trade. And so how can a ruler know when he is taxing the people too much, providing too much for them, and how does he know when he needs to stop providing or attempting to provide so much for the people from the state?
Well, I think some of those, like the good equipment for soldiers, and even to a certain extent the docks, because those are necessary for military purposes, those lie under the second principle as well of keeping the military prepared, engaged, and ready for battle. And I think a lot of what Machiavelli is talking about is the unnecessary things. And his focus is more on the ruler staying in power. And so those necessities are going to have to take place for the ruler to stay in power. If your soldiers are not trained well and don't have proper equipment, well, then you're going to have to either hire soldiers or you're not going to be as effective in battle. And kind of same thing with like the docks, even like if you don't have a method of an easy way to go into like naval warfare, then you're not going to be able to defend your country. So I think things like that kind of fall under that, the second principle more, and Machiavelli is more talking about extra things kind of, and more of like comforts, whereas like military equipment, he focuses a lot more on the importance of the military than on the importance of the comfort of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another difficult balance to be attained is this idea of being feared but not too much. And this kind of notion that the ruler needs to be stern with the people or a little harsh with them, and yet at the same time cannot inspire hatred. And this also seems to be kind of a difficult balance to attain. And I was wondering if you could say more of what it looks like. Dealing with students has always been a challenge of mine, knowing just how to have that balance. But to use a less controversial example, our house cats, I'm very curious. I tend to be the one that brings down the law and actually gives punishment for bad behavior. And particularly some of my younger children think I'm really overly stern, and they point to the fact that whenever I come into a room, the cat's going to start sulking away and just leave that room. They don't like to be in my presence. And so we want to be, the ruler wants to be liked. He wants to be the nice guy. And yet, if people know you never punish, that reputation gets around pretty fast. And so what does this look like for a ruler who knows this right balance of how to keep people just, well, as I heard one time, a good teacher is much loved and a little feared?
Well, I think for a ruler it's important that almost the opposite of what you said for a teacher, to be much feared and a little loved. Because for the leader to be feared, he needs to be respected and he needs to be able to lay down the law, and part of that is I think lies in maintaining the law but not putting into place unnecessary cruel laws. And for the leader to be feared and not hated, he needs to still not appease the people, but keep on a persona of being for the people, working for them, even if he's not at all. Because if it looks like to them that he's not doing anything for the people, then obviously they're going to hate him, and that's where it causes problems, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting trying to find an example in our own system that seems to reflect this. Like the President of the United States does not actually ever bring punishment on anyone. Our judiciary does that.
Yeah.
And so, the President never punishes anyone. However, you definitely hear stories about how presidents manage their staff. That, if there's a staff member that's not towing the line or doing what the president wants, he says, you're out of here, you're fired, you're gone. And he's willing to strip somebody like that. And so there's a certain, some presidents have run their cabinets with more brutality, others kind of more gentle. And there seems to be different levels of success that they have in being able to keep an organized cabinet. Why do you think it is more important for a leader to be feared than to be loved?
Well, first of all, I think Machiavelli is very specifically talking more of absolute monarchy or dictatorship. So it's definitely hard to draw a parallel to our own system in that way, because there are checks and balances to make sure that our presidents, to a certain extent, don't do that. But I think that it's important for the leader to be careful to pick his battles almost, not to get caught up in petty disputes, and then look from there into what is important, what is worth engaging, and what really will affect his leadership or the duration of his leadership or ruling, which is, I guess, is kind of where it's different for us, because the president has, his term of 4 years, max of 8 if he gets reelected, whereas, Tiberius was king for over 20 years. So I think for presidents, there's less of a, I don't want to say less of a reason to do that, but at the same time, because it's a different duration, the maintaining of power is a different idea than it was for Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm.
Since he's talking about power that can be overthrown, and if the people don't fear the leader enough, then the people will not feel like he's strong enough to withhold a rebellion or to keep his office.
Mm-hmm. You kind of avoided some of the more controversial elements of Machiavelli. You'd never brought up the virtue of Agathocles, the ruler of Syracuse, who brought in all the leading nobles for a meeting, and because he found that there's too much dispute amongst them, brought in his soldiers and killed off every one of them. And Machiavelli says, pretty good choice. He ruled Syracuse pretty well after that, kind of kept things quiet. This is kind of why we get the term Machiavellian. And you didn't touch on any of that. Is there a reason why you avoid that sort of thing in Machiavelli?
Well, I didn't really purposely avoid it. I just, like, when I was writing it, I didn't think of it. But I think he's writing on ancient world leaders, and, you know, to a certain extent, he's right that that leader stayed in power. And that's kind of why Tiberius, I didn't have too many examples of Tiberius's cruelty, but he, you know, had his reign of terror. And that's kind of one of the reasons why he was able to stay in power for so long. It wasn't because he was a nice person. So I think Machiavelli's idea is that if you to stay in power, you have to be aggressive. You have to be able to quell rebellions as soon as they're starting and keep the country in check. So I think that example, I mean, it's hard to look at, and I'm not saying that it's a moral or just thing. At the end of my paper, I very specifically was like this: Machiavelli is not supposed to be moral or just. He's not talking about what a good man is or a good leader in the sense that we think of leadership. He's talking about how a monarch or someone who's in absolute power can stay there as long as possible. And in his opinion, it's pretty much like nothing is off limits, except for there is a line that is crossed when you develop the hatred of the people and not the fear anymore. Because if the people don't fear you and they just outright hate you, then they'll be willing to sacrifice a lot more to get rid of you.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Honestly.
So first off, it's awesome to be really relevant. I was wondering if you did the same qualities that encourage success for Tiberius and Marius would still be effective today.
I think to a certain extent they would be. I don't know if this makes sense, but the actions they use to demonstrate those principles, I don't think those actions would be beneficial or effective today, but I think those same principles can be used to stay in power, if that makes sense.
Do you think that there's any advice that or qualities that Machiavelli gave that are outmoded or outdated today?
I think the one that's probably the hardest today is the fourth principle, that it is only necessary for a leader to not be hated. Just because I think now the necessity to put on a persona of charisma and power, but not to be more of a people's man, is connects more today than it did then, just because that's what we see around us more and that's what we see in office more. So I think other than that one, I think most of them are pretty up to date. The hard thing with that is, I don't know, this might sound weird, but in America we don't have that dynamic really. So it's harder to measure. And I mean, these principles aren't for America, they're not for democracy at all. So I think that if you're looking at a country that's run the same way as these examples that I used for Machiavelli, then yes, these principles would be up to date, but but for our country, it's a different situation.
Yeah, oftentimes we think about these harsh rulers and look at them and have a certain sense of condemnation for them. I found it interesting how much in Russian history their rulers tend to be very brutal. Opposition, dissent, oftentimes met with the gallows, and really strong-handed people. And I've wondered how much that shapes a culture to have that sort of rule. And one of my most vivid memories as a child was picking tangelos for Fran Hillebrick. And I one time was not paying very close attention when I was picking, and I had some rotten oranges in there. And after I delivered the oranges, next time I showed up, she met me out there and let me have it. I have never been yelled at so much. And I think I was probably 11 or 12. It had me shaking in my boots. I will admit, though, every time I picked tangelos after that, I really paid attention to those tangelos. And I'm just kind of wondering, we have a day and age when, brutality, oppression, these are looked down upon pretty strongly. And Plato describes in a democratic age, everyone is all about how can you tell me what to do. And how much is it really bad for our character not to be in the midst of those who will be pretty strong with us?
Well, I think the culture definitely does affect that. You look at Russia or even some European, not as much anymore European countries, but and you see that they still, I don't want to say they still live by Machiavelli's principles, but especially in Russia, there's kind of more of a gruff culture that isn't as, the American culture is very much like you said, how can you tell me what to do? You can't tell me what I'm allowed to do or where I'm allowed to be or any of that. And I think, I don't know if it's the government that's changed that as much, because it used to be more as far as laws, and now it's turned into pretty much everything. It's like you can't even tell me what gender I am, that sort of thing, where you're like, okay, going over the top. But I don't think that comes from our government. I think that comes from more the social media culture. But, even in other countries, they run into those problems. But I think that our government isn't what sets forward those, the ideas that we have of not even just the don't tell me what to do as far as the government, but it's run down to even your teacher can't tell you what to do, and parents and all that, which I don't want to say that's a recent development, but you look at America 100 years ago, and it was a very, very different place. So I don't think that developed from our government. That's cultural.
I guess just the question, how much can a person's character be spoiled by too much consideration? And, you think about the one extreme of consideration being the waiter at the restaurant, okay? What would you like? I would like this. Good choice, okay? The waiter is always there to serve. And when we have a situation where everyone in our life is kind of like a waiter, what does that do to us? I think it's in the book of Colossians. There's make reference to the Roman practice of the Roman patricians having their children raised as slaves. They would not be raised as son of the emperor or son of the patrician. They would actually be raised among the slaves. It was considered good for them, even though it might be difficult to see your son being beaten, to be raised in that fashion, you had a better chance of becoming, in the end, a man than if you were raised with too much consideration. And so when we look at the world of Machiavelli, and is the world that he is giving perhaps a world that would be more possibly creating men than a world where there are no Machiavellian rulers?
I think so, because the manner that a Machiavellian ruler rules is to keep his country, I don't want to say keep his country in check, but like to kind of sum it all up, it's kind of like keeping the country in check, keeping the military ready to fight, and maintaining a level of fear from people, not being overly generous, and in that way, the people then have to more fend for themselves, whereas once you lose any sort of, like in that country, in that empire, the people have the responsibility to find the food they need. If the leader is not liberal or generous, then he's not going to be giving out handouts. He's not going to be trying to appease the people. So if you live in a culture where there's not appeasement, where you're not getting handouts, where the responsibility is on you, then yes, it's going to raise more real men, I guess.
Thank you. Other questions?
Anna.
First off, I'm really good at that. Machiavelli is always very fun. I wanted to ask you, this week brought up the leader Heracles, who was, I suppose you could say, contradicting Machiavelli's principles by being a very liberal and generous leader. So, he was also very effective. So I wanted to ask, do you think that Machiavelli is the only way, or his principles are the only way to be an effective leader?
I think Machiavelli's leadership is built for a very specific type of empire. Obviously, there are other instances of leaders being successful without having all of those principles. I don't think it's the only way to be an effective leader. I think his principles are mainly there for the leader to stay in power as long as possible. They're not there to show this is the only way, and I believe he says that in his book. He says this is not the only way, this is the way I think is the most effective and will maintain peace the longest. So,
In that case, how much would you say historical context affects Machiavelli's principles?
I think, in his book he definitely uses a lot of historical examples. He talks about different people who have been successful and who failed. He obviously doesn't cover everyone for a very long time. But I think he was definitely writing at a specific time in history. Someone wrote now about that, it would look incredibly different. But I think the historical context means a lot. I think the principles to a certain extent stay the same. If I remember correctly, even Heracles follows not all of these principles, but a portion of them. So I think that the execution would probably be a lot different depending on when in history he had written this, but the bones would stay the same.
Of course, you mentioned that Machiavelli, his described leader is something of a tyrant. He's definitely a good person, paper. But anyway, some people have, or someone, I can't remember exactly who, told me that, or pointed out that Machiavelli, the prince, might be actually a condemnation of monarchy as a whole, rather than something to be taken at face value as how he thinks a country should be ruled, meaning it is pointing out what you might, the tyranny you need to actually stay in power. How true do you think that is?
I think after studying the principles at great length and trying to find all the quotes and stuff, I think, I can't speak for the whole book, but I think his 5 principles are very specific for a reason. He goes over carefully what they should mean, and specifically the 5th one about the cunning of the fox and the nobility and strength of the lion, as well as almost all of them make, I don't say they make sense, but they logically follow with the type of leader and the type of country he's trying to run. So I don't think that he's written it as a condemnation. I haven't looked into that perspective at all. So if I went back and read it, looking at it in that way, I might come to a different conclusion, but at the moment I would say that he's right. Alex?
Now you did say in the end of your paper that this isn't necessarily a moral or just leader,
Yeah.
but even so, to what extent do you think a moral or just leader could use these Machiavellian principles, or would they really just have to throw them out entirely because it's just not compatible at all?
I think it could possibly be compatible. I think it'd be very difficult because there would definitely be a very specific balance that would have to be found. Whereas for the Machiavellian leader, one of the things that he goes over is kind of like there's not really, I don't want to say there's no limitation, but to a certain extent that's kind of his idea that these principles, you follow these principles and you can follow them to the greatest extent you wish to. Whereas if a leader is trying to be moral and trying to be just, it would be harder, especially with the not being loved by the subjects, not being liberal or generous, the cunning of the fox. And Machiavelli also says that like you need the power of the lion, but he kind of says that the nobility of the lion is to be only put on as a persona and not really to be used in action. It's more of a cover than any sort of something of substance. So I think if you took the bare bones of the principle, you could definitely apply them, but it would be a lot harder to apply them in a moral and just way than as a tyrant such as Tiberius does, kind of hiding your limitations.
Other questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Hobson.